In 1817, William Gell and John Peter Gandy published Pompeiana, arguably the most influential book on Pompeii to be written in the English language during the 19th century. Pompeiana is generally remembered today for the quality of the engravings based on drawing by Gell, and we have here the Poet's House restored, and it's the very imaginative and vivid reconstruction of both the exteriors and the interiors that particularly caught the imagination of the public. But rather than focusing on images such as these, attractive though they are, I want to focus on this, labelled simply, Kitchen in the House of Actaeon. The text went on to refer to a conveniency, according to modern, at least English ideas, most inconveniently situated. The woodwork of the seat is gone, the marks of the hinges and fastening the door may be observed. In ancient Italy, observed Gell delicately, as in modern Italy and Greece, a proximity between the ultimate receptacle of the aliments and their place of preparation was considered desirable. Nonetheless, it was sufficient to shock the sense of the propriety of the Eclectic Review, whose reviewer complained of a strange want of good order and good taste in arrangements involving the decencies of civilized life. Prior to publication, Gell in Naples and his co-author in London had exchanged letters discussing the content of their book. Gandy had pressed Gell to provide more information on the gritty realities of day-to-day life in Pompeii. He requested some dissertation or essay upon the state of the houses when found, with a sort of arrangement saying the beds do not remain untumbled or the stools unworm-eaten. Gell unsurprisingly failed to describe any unmade beds, but the reader was informed that they were generally made of carpets and vests and laid upon the ground. But the two were also intrigued by arrangements for personal hygiene. Gandy appealed to Gell, "Pray do describe me. What sort of place was the necessary à la mode or anglais? Or did you contrive matters by sitting across a stick?" A month later, he renewed his plea for Gell's views on whether it is probable they used chamber pots or pissed into the compluvium, whether each house had a boggery, or if you do not think the outside of a door was a midnight place of deposit for the cacatorial exuberance. Why do I bring this up, apart from the opportunity to share some early 19th century scatological humour? My point is that the discovery of Pompeii, which was, after all, like any Romano-British city, small and provincial, a colony of Rome, coincided with and provided an important stimulus to a much wider shift in historical and antiquarian thought that was chiefly interested in the everyday. But although I've read a considerable amount of antiquarian publications, unpublished treatises, journals and correspondence, this is the first instance I've come across of any explicit discussion of sanitary arrangements. So Pompeii offered a vision of everyday life in ancient Rome. Indeed, the publication of Pompeiana promised its readers an insight into what it called the domestic economy of a Roman people. Issues of personal hygiene, as we shall see, did begin to feature in accounts of Roman Britain, as did interest in family structure, Roman trade and industry, agriculture, and the processes of acculturation with both the Britons and the Saxons. Most importantly, Pompeii provided evidence through which the archaeological remains in Britain could be interpreted at precisely a time when students of Romano-British antiquities were beginning to think critically about the period of Romano-British history, not simply as one of military occupation, but one of domestic stability, which saw substantial urban development, agricultural prosperity, international trade, and the beginnings of domestic manufactures. So in this lecture, I want to explore the following themes which contributed to significant changes in the ways in which Roman Britain was imagined and understood. Firstly, as I've already suggested, was the invention or discovery of non-militarized Roman presence in Britain, the recognition of a thriving Romano-British culture, which was particularly focused upon towns. One of the threads which links these lectures together is the gathering interest in domesticity and the role of material culture in facilitating its study. Romano-British antiquities proved particularly important in this respect. This relates to a second theme, the differentiation of a period of Roman Britain lasting more than 400 years. The traditions inherited from the early modern period saw it through the prism of the arrival of the Romans, the campaigns of Agricola, the subjugation of the British through arts of civilization, and then a lamentation for the departure and extinction of Roman culture by the barbarian Saxon invaders. I'm interested in how antiquaries started to complicate this static model, how they developed a sense of change and development within this period of Romano-British history. There's increasing fuzziness and untidiness around the boundaries at either end, as, in the light of archaeological evidence, they realise that cultural exchange and the transitions between Britons, Romans and Saxons were far more gradual and the consequences far less seismic than traditionally represented. Conquest and invasion alone could not account for cultural change. Thirdly is the study of how Romano-British antiquities allows us to see developments in what contemporaries would have called archaeological science. The work of antiquaries and archaeologists in recording and interpreting Roman antiquities in cities such as London, York, Chester or Lincoln show interesting methodological developments. Finally, and most important for the theme of a historic town, how did discoveries of Roman antiquities in cities contribute to the image and historical representations of the towns in which they were discovered? To what extent did the Victorians actually take cognizance of the Roman ruins buried beneath their streets? Did the efforts of antiquaries and archaeologists filter into a more popular awareness of Roman origins and the city as palimpsest? So that's my preamble. I want now to consider the image of Roman Britain in the first half of the 18th century to establish the degree of change. The 1720s and 1730s were particularly rich in publications. John Poynter's Britannia Romana of 1724, William Stukely Itinerarium Curiosum of the same year, Nathaniel Salmon Roman Stations in Britain 1726, Alexander Gordon Itinerarium Septentrionale in 1726, John Horsley Britannia Romana of the Roman Antiquities of Britain 1732, Francis Drake Eboracum 1736, John Warburton Valum Romanum in 1753. This is quite a notable concentration on the north of the country. The Act of Union, as others have observed, tended to concentrate the mind upon earlier precedents for a united province of Britannia. And for the first time, what we now know as Hadrian's Wall, then known as the Roman Wall, became the object of serious antiquarian study. Unsurprisingly, this emphasis upon the military outposts of the north of England and the military campaigns of Agricola in the lowlands of Scotland reinforced the tendency to think about Roman Britain in highly militarised terms. We might take as an illustrative example of the general tenor of inquiry the questions that Alexander Gordon hoped to be able to answer through his fieldwork. Through what part of Britain did Agricola march his army, and how far into the country? Where were these places of encampment made in that march? What were those firths which he passed over with his army in that expedition? What may we rationally conjecture were the cities and peoples who yielded to Agricola, suffering garrisons and castles to be built about them? William Stukely was similarly an admirer of a Roman wall, but his observations in Iter Boreale were published posthumously, not until 1776. In Itinerarium Curiosum, he shifted attention away from the north of England to the Midlands and the south, and included his own discoveries, such as the Roman amphitheatres of Dorchester and Silchester. His approach was to trace the various Roman roads of Britain in a series of peregrinations, in which he recorded his observations on the antiquities and monuments he encountered along his way. In a sense, it's a record of Stukely's ramblings across England in pursuit of antiquities, social contacts, and a cure for his gout. It wasn't an exercise in the accurate mapping of Roman civil engineering, although the essential framework was based upon the Antonine itinerary. But Stukely also used it to explore his own imaginative relationship with ancient Rome and to contrast his idealized vision of Roman virtue and patriotism with the depravity which he feared was encroaching upon modern society. The accuracy of his observations and his ability to interpret the evidence of landscape and ruins brought a vivid clarity to his account of Roman antiquities, which was lacking in other publications. And his identification of Roman stations and his interpretation of classical sources remained highly influential. Not all antiquaries were convinced, however, by his rendition of Roman street plans, which were deemed to be too visionary, and Thomas Hearne dismissed with incredulity his perceptive identification of the amphitheatre at Silchester. But even Stukely was far more interested in identifying the site of Caesar's camp on a plan of Roman London than in thinking about the development of a city that Tacitus had described as so full of business and merchants. In the same spirit, the London historian William Maitland, like any other antiquary of the time, assumed that any Roman remains uncovered would have been those of a Roman camp. Even the presence of a tessellated pavement in St. George's Fields was not evidence of a Roman villa, but of the fact that a Roman general had set down his camp there, it being well known that any self-respecting Roman general invariably travelled with the mosaic to be laid down as a kind of travelling carpet. Such interest as there was in the impact of Roman civilization on the Britons wavered between those who, like Sir John Clarke, applauded the advent of civilization and the arts, and those who, good students of Tacitus as they were, deplored the loss of Britain's spirit of freedom and liberty as they were suborned by the luxuries and refinements of Roman civilization. But actually documenting or describing this process of cultural change was not, however, a topic that antiquaries in the 18th century engaged with. I could multiply the examples, but the key points are that antiquaries were tracing Roman roads for the movement of armies. They were piecing together the network of military camps and stations. They were searching for evidence of military conflict. And there was an assumption that nothing of architectural or artistic merit was likely to be found in a remote province like Britain. Indeed, its only claim for notice lay in its military fortification, the Roman Wall, rather than civil architecture. Horace Walpole, of course, dismissed the Roman remains in Britain on the grounds that they were upon a foot with what ideas we should get of Inigo Jones if somebody was to publish views of huts and houses that our officers run up in Senegal and Goree. Antiquaries' interest was primarily in Roman inscriptions. Archaeology, as Alexander Gordon had explained in his preface, consists of monuments, or rather inscriptions still subsisting, in order to prove demonstratively those facts which are asserted in history. Where inscriptions failed, there were coins, and the cabinet of coins was a staple of any antiquarian collection. The obvious point is that both of these were valued insofar as they offered textual information or corroboration, not new information. And the materiality of either coins or inscriptions was barely considered. And not only did they provide evidence that could be cross-referenced with writings of Roman historians, but they referred to specific people. Archaeologists today deal routinely with remains of people who are anonymous and essentially unknowable. But for the antiquaries of the 18th century, an antiquity derived its meaning chiefly from an association with a known figure. Hence the impulse to make the most implausible connections, satirized so deftly by Scott in Jonathan Oldbuck's character. Even at Bath, that preeminent site of Roman health and leisure, 18th century antiquaries' interest in and attitudes towards the archaeological finds was decidedly ambivalent. Describing the remains of a temple excavated in around 1790, Sir Henry Englefield was damning with faint praise. The capital, he wrote in a paper for Archaeologia, was of good form, but nothing different from the usual. The base, however, was of so very bad a design that it was quite disgusting to put it on paper. The antiquarian man of letters, Richard Warner, wrote a celebratory history of Bath in 1801, tracing the resort's progressive rise to civility and refinement through to the 18th century. But despite his own evidence to the contrary, his version of Roman Bath was primarily of a military camp. We find a surprising reluctance to explore the implications of the finds that had been uncovered, rather basing his arguments upon the Roman authority on castraменtation of the Getius. He suggested that the baths had been the first public buildings to be erected, while the soldiers were still accommodated in huts which ran in straight lines from the praetorium. In total, the walls would have held 3,050 foot and 540 horse, a quarter of a complete legion. Thereafter, he lost interest in the form or appearance of Roman path and emphasized instead, following Tacitus, the rapid descent into luxury and enervation of the young men of the surrounding tribes who were inevitably drawn to the fleshpots of Aquae Sulis. However, the progressive accumulation of more and more antiquities, which were clearly of a non-military origin, hastened the process of revisioning Roman Britain. The material evidence of Romanized Britons was first recognized in the context of burials, initially by an eccentric Kentish antiquary called Brian Fawcett. He was actually sent down from Oxford for harbouring a prostitute in his room, so that's a different story. Fawcett excavated over 750 barrows in an antiquarian career of enormous energy. As you might have guessed, his career in the church never went particularly far. He never published his findings during his lifetime and mistakenly assumed that the graves and burial mounds that he disinterred belonged not to Saxons, as was recognised in the 19th century, but from Romans Britannised or Britons Romanised. To this extent, he represents the early modern tendency, which assumed that any object of antiquity had to be Roman, unless definitively proven otherwise, and that included Stonehenge. But in other respects, he's indicative of a shift towards a non-militarized view of Rome. Fawcett realized that the burial sites that he unearthed were not, as his predecessors had assumed, the burial place of Britons who had fallen resisting Julius Caesar's invasion, but the interments of a peaceable society, where children were buried with their toys and women with their household implements, that is, of Britons Romanized and Romans Britannised. Fawcett's findings were largely unpublished, as I've said, but others, by the late 18th century, were beginning to arrive at similar conclusions. So an early 18th century historian of Bristol pointed out that the simple fact that there was an army of up to 36,000 men stationed in Britain in receipt of pay must have had a considerable effect in promoting trade, commerce, and urban development. Meanwhile, news of the discoveries being made in Herculaneum and Pompeii also played a part, revealing unprecedented insights into the civilian lifestyle of the Romans, and encouraged the English to identify modest parallels in their own country. Daines Barrington described antiquities found at Cirencester and Stonesfield. The mosaic pavement, he said, is not great, yet it equals that of several rooms at Herculaneum. Samuel Lysons, who succeeded Gough as director of the Society of Antiquaries, capitalised on this interest in his representation of the various Roman villas that he excavated through the south of England and the Midlands, where the emphasis was upon the mosaic pavements rather than the villas as evidence of a peaceful Romano civilization. But perhaps it's not too much to say, he suggested. No province of a Roman Empire contained a greater number of extensive and richly decorated villas. The Roman wall was becoming less significant. Thus, the process by which it became possible to think of a domesticated Roman presence was slow, but by this time clearly perceptible. In 1799, when Thomas Reynolds surveyed the various types of antiquities available for the study of Roman Britain, in addition to the traditional trinity of coins, inscriptions, and roads, he also listed baths and mosaics. So there's an increasing awareness that many of the material remains were actually the remnants of domestic Roman society, which had lasted for over 400 years and were not simply the vestigia of a series of military camps and fortifications. But to return to Lysons, from whose publications I want to highlight a couple of other points. First is his reconstruction of a Roman temple at Bath. He was rather more interested in this than was Englefield, and I think we can see how obvious parallels of the way in which Gell and Mazzois were trying to reconstruct the antiquities of Pompeii, and indeed how Piranesi had tried to imaginatively reconstruct ancient Rome even earlier. So instead of imagining and representing ancient monuments and buildings within their urban context, as Lysons did here, was actually becoming much more common. And the important point, another important point, is that it's not simply a single building, but it's, in effect, a streetscape. It's a building in its urban context, which reflects an increasing tendency in both Romano-British and Roman antiquarianism, the studies of ancient Rome, to think of a town as a whole rather than simply a collection of isolated monuments. The second point is that Lyson suggested that the villa at Bignor, the one that so inspired Charles Roche Smith, might have belonged to Cogidubnus, the first century client ruler of Aregni. Why is this significant? Well, first of all, it's a move away from assuming that every Roman site was the camp of a Roman general. And secondly, it's recognition of the extent to which it was realised that Britons participated in Roman culture. It relied upon acceptance of the material evidence for Romanised Britons living in peaceable coexistence with the Romans. And this would become increasingly clearly delineated in the course of a century. As another antiquary, Samuel Sayre, noted, the number of suburban villas with their tessellated pavements indicated that the country, as well as the town, was orderly and well affected and not liable to insurrection and revolt. Under this government, they seem to have attained a degree of civility, population and prosperity, which being overthrown by the extinction of a Roman power, they could not recover for many centuries. So we're seeing now increasing recognition of a process of cultural interchange between the Romans and the Britons prior to and during the Roman occupation. Such antiquaries such as Lysons were even suggesting that a room be devoted to Romano-British remains in the British Museum as early as 1810. This is an idea that would not be implemented for some 40 years. Similarly, the term Romano-British as a descriptor is being used with increasing frequency. And this reflects the increasing frequency with which materials are being uncovered, whether it's through agriculture, the increasing amount of land being taken under the plough through enclosure in this period, or whether it's being uncovered in the towns and cities. Rebuilding and new buildings, street widening, gas mains, sewers, the introduction of a railway stimulated the interest of antiquaries such as William Warr, to whom I introduced you yesterday, and Charles Roche Smith. All of this transformed the understanding of urban Roman Britain. Of course, urban improvement had happened before the 19th century, but the key point about gas mains and sewers is the depth to which they were dug, much deeper than any other previous attempts at improvement. Similarly, railways were being cut through areas where there may never have been any kind of excavation at all. In addition to cutting through burial sites in rural areas, extramural cemeteries, for example, were regularly being uncovered, as well as the foundations of Roman housing or evidence of drainage system. And in Edinburgh, for example, the drainage works undertaken in the area of the North Loch in 1822 revealed an ancient causeway, which was discovered to have run beneath the foundations of buildings on Canongate. This, suggested Daniel Wilson, was not improbably a relic of a Roman invasion. And while in London, the construction of New London Bridge and its approach road proved to be particularly fruitful in the production of antiquities, in addition to large caches of coins, more remarkable finds, including pieces of statuary. We've got some examples from one of Charles Knight's publications there. So it's London I want to focus upon now. The largest city, the greatest extent of rebuilding, and the richest field for archaeology, and also the field of study for some of the more interesting antiquaries and archaeologists, including Charles Roche Smith, who I introduced you yesterday, and another antiquary, Alfred Kemp. And it's during the 1820s that we start to find new ways of thinking about Roman London, which get out of the tram lines, which had essentially been laid down at the end of the 17th century in the wake of the rebuilding of the Great Fire, where we have people like Bagford, Conyers, Woodward, and Christopher Wren. During the 1820s, Kemp and Roche Smith were starting to collect systematically and to record antiquities discovered in the course of improvement. So Kemp wrote a series of short reports and finds for the Gentleman's Magazine under the title of Londiniana, as well as some more detailed articles for Archaeologia. He is really fascinated by these objects, and although his suggestions are hardly earth-shattering from a modern perspective, he illustrates this very interesting shift in the way that evidence was being interpreted and the kinds of questions that were being asked. He tried to think about the density of population. He didn't simply make assumptions on the basis of what Tacitus had said about Boadicea's revolt, but on the basis of finds of Samian earthenware, coins and lamps, and the evidence of the foundations of houses, and the profusion in which these were found. These, he argued, were indicative of high density of population. He asked questions about how private houses were built, clearly showing the influence of Pompeiana. And how were they heated? Did they have chimneys? Did they use braziers as in Pompeii? Or did they use the hypocaust system? What kind of materials were used for floor covering? What would the interior of a house look like? What were the walls constructed of? How were they decorated? He noted how the Romans seemed to favour the use of chalk, as it would have been more readily obtained than stone. Their walls were up to 2 foot thick, lined with fine stucco, painted red with borders of green or yellow streaks. Tired old questions, such as the site of Caesar's camp or the Praetorium, didn't interest him at all. Rather, he focused upon identifying the contours of commercial London. In doing so, he arrived at an understanding of Roman London as a functioning, populated commercial city where goods were manufactured, traded, and consumed. The large earthenware mortars found in great numbers on the south side of Eastcheap were, he suggested, used by primitive colonists of Roman London for triturating their corn. Further, I'm led to infer from the discovery of these mortars, amphorae and simpler, that the street of Eastcheap was a forum mercatorium of much resort in Roman times, where might be had corn, wine, and oil in abundance. The mortars, he suggested, seem to indicate the establishment of bakers on the spot, for we know that they derive from the very title of their trade from being accustomed to pound the hand grain into flour. The area was also, he suggested, one of more general trade, which he inferred from the presence of crucibles, and a stone last found in the northeast corner indicated the making of sandals, a shoemaker. By this time, we should note a surprisingly number of well-preserved leather sandals had actually been recovered from the Thames. Kemp's fellow worker in the field, and of rather greater importance as an archaeologist, was, of course, Charles Roche Smith. Smith, not without reason, represented his own career as one of perpetual struggle against those who failed to recognise the significance of archaeological finds, and who attempted to thwart his efforts, and whose interest in antiquities extended only so far as they could be sold for a profit. London's citizens, he complained, had always been indifferent to the relics of the past, and they seem rather pleased to find some daring champion who will decry the glory and honour of Roman London, because he helps to shield them from their share of reproach under the pretext that what never existed could never have been destroyed. So cynical. He was in a state of permanent conflict with the Corporation of London over their failure to protect the city's archaeological heritage. They suspected him, meanwhile, of appropriating antiquities from corporation property in order to sell them off, and resented his vilification of them in the press. He always suspected, probably rightly, that the compulsory purchase order on his property in Lothbury was at least partly vindictive. And his comments on those contracted to carry out public works were bracingly dismissive. The vacant stare with which you are greeted while endeavouring to glean information or take a sketch of any object in the course of demolition under their reckless hands, and the jealous eye with which you are viewed when your object is discovered, is lamentable as well as laughable. But as any London archaeologist will tell you, he did make a groundbreaking contribution to the understanding of Roman London. He identified the riverside wall, the location of a Roman bridge, the existence of extensive Roman settlement in Southwark. He disproved the tradition that St. Paul's was built on the site of a temple of Diana. He pointed out the density of communications of Kent and the Kentish coast, and for the first time offered a historical understanding of the gradual expansion of London, being very much aware that Roman London had been a continually evolving urban settlement. It grew and shrank, and for much of its history was not even walled. He identified evidence of a gradual conversion of marshy land for urban settlement around the banks of the Thames and Walbrook, and drew up a detailed analysis of the drainage and means of land reclamation. It must, he argued, have been the work of long and prosperous settlement to extend the city from Blackfriars to the Tower in length, and from the Thames to Moorfields in width. And he also demonstrated how earlier buildings were clearly destroyed by the Romans, not the Saxons, the usual scapegoats, and then subsequently incorporated into later Roman structures. A section of the wall in Queen Street had been discovered in which large sculptured and ornamented mouldings had been built, which had clearly originally come from a frieze or entablature of a much larger edifice, only to be pulled down and recycled. So this sense of a growth, decline, and rebuilding within the Roman period is being actually articulated for the first time. But he resisted the temptation to revise Stukely's hypothetical street plan of Roman London. Another of his key arguments was that the street plan of modern London bore absolutely no relation to that of a Roman Londinium, and it was futile to try to reconstruct a street plan simply from the snapshots of evidence that were made available when sinking shafts of sewers and things. Even with the excavations consequent upon London's improvements, was still, in fact, a very evident absence of the visible traces of a Roman city in London. Compared to somewhere like Rome or even cities of southern France, there was not much evidence of Roman magnificence. And this, as he's already suggested, played into the hands of those who saw little value in looking back into the past for signs of former glory, and was easily incorporated into a narrative which emphasised London's modern commercial greatness. But what Roche Smith achieved was to highlight the fact that extensive remains did exist, but were invisible precisely because of London's success. Near continuous occupation on the same site meant that the archaeological evidence of Roman London was buried deep beneath the surface, but exist it did, and this was testimony to London's uniquely successful history as a centre of commerce, rather than simply a military centre or city of royal and ecclesiastical power. Londinium couldn't rival Italian cities in remains of public buildings or statues, yet, he reminded his readers, the reflective antiquary can still find materials to work on, can point to the localities of the less obtrusive and imposing, but not less useful structures, the habitations of a mercantile and trading population of this ever mercantile town. So importantly, his conception of a town rested not simply on the public buildings, but the private dwellings, the workshops of the artisan and manufacturer, and what he called the various humble structures which make up the bulk of cities and towns. Like Kemp, he was fascinated by the fragmentary evidence of the presence and disposition of these structures that he uncovered on a daily basis, and the evidence that they provided for trade and manufactures. They were, he said, valuable evidence of the state of a population, of the arts, the industry, and the manners and customs of Roman London. The point of archaeological research, as he noted in Archaeologia, is the study of mankind, and evidence from rubbish heaps, from the ruins of domestic houses, from the decoration of fictile vessels and wall paintings, allowed one to do precisely that. Some examples of the types of fragmentary evidence that he was uncovering. This relationship with rubbish is important. Antiquaries had always been ridiculed for their inability to distinguish dross from gold. They were, in Addison's satirical phrase, critics in rust. Roche Smith was different. He appreciated that things that survived in rubbish tips would not otherwise have come down to the present. Rather than dismissing rubbish, it was precisely because it was rubbish that it was important. Many objects which in their day were among the most common and disregarded survived the wreck of the buildings in which they occupied the humblest place. Or it may have been that the remains we now collect and study with so much avidity had been dismissed to the receptacle of refuse long before the destruction of villas in which they had done service. The gravel pits cum rubbish pits that were found near the Royal Exchange were particularly fruitful, not least because of the boggy conditions that preserved organic matter, such as leather sandals and wooden spindles. So Smith's appreciation of the value of rubbish, the unregarded antiquities, enabled him to develop a much more diverse picture of Roman Britain. His painstaking analysis of apparently insignificant pottery finds, for example, indicated the multiple sites of manufacture and suggested a vision of an integrated economy of pottery, manufacture and exchange. He identified kilns near St Paul's at the corner of Lombard Street and William Street, and additional potteries as far away as Medway in Kent, Hampshire, Northamptonshire, Yorkshire, Shropshire and Staffordshire, all of which had supplied fictile vessels for the needs of Londinium. He was also aware of how the survival of organic remains opened up new fields that had not hitherto been addressed by antiquaries, but were rather the province of anatomists or naturalists. Not something that he actually had expertise in himself, but he recognised that this was something that could be worthy of further inquiry and research, that would show the sorts of food commonly used, the mode of life and the character of the people. Strangely, he had little to say about the arrangements of the ultimate reception of the aliments that had so fascinated Gell, but his friend, Thomas Wright, actually did, and with a similar commendation for the historical value of rubbish, admitted that one circumstance remains to be noticed with regard to the economy of the Roman towns. We have yet discovered no arrangements about the Roman houses for personal easement. However, as he told his readers, close outside most Roman towns, numbers of deep and very narrow round wells are found, which he suggested were the remains of such conveniences. And they were, moreover, rich mines of the antiquary from the great number of miscellaneous articles they contain. So this new generation of antiquaries, Roche Smith and Thomas Wright and others, were interested in anything for the light that it could cast on what historians today would call the practice of everyday life. And they were highly critical of the dismissive attitude of earlier antiquaries towards objects that were deemed wanting aesthetically, or which could not be confidently associated with a famous individual or event. Where Gordon had seen archaeology as the corroboration of information from texts, Roche Smith and his peers appreciated the potential for the generation of information of a kind that had not even been recorded in any of the classical sources. In the Illustrations of Roman London, published in 1852, he provided a series of images ranging from the specimens of quality craftsmanship, including figures of Apollo and Mercury, to the more prosaic and everyday lamps and locks, keys and knives, and little figures such as the peacock that we see there. His commentary is laconic, but the reader can take away some key themes. First is the sophistication of Roman craftsmanship. For example, the glassware used techniques that had previously been thought to have been limited to the 19th century, and more prosaically, the locks, he argued, were equal to those produced in modern times. Secondly was the similarity of domestic articles and implements of daily life from the Romans to their equivalents in the present day. And the spindle of wood still retained woolen filaments that had been preserved in the gravel pit at the site of a Royal Exchange. This, he suggested, was evidence of Roman textile industry and a precursor, he noted, to the modern manufacturing strength. Thirdly is the evidence of family life, not simply military occupation. Smith noted the presence of children's toys and sandals, of the various female implements such as tweezers and hairpins. The family life and childhood were now being recognised in the archaeological record. Finally was the evidence of the sophistication of a Romano-British economy, which he saw exemplified in finds such as a medicine stamp, which was interpreted as evidence of the presence of professions in Roman Britain and of the sophistication of a civilization. And the finds of the bronzes, the painted walls, and the mosaic pavements and fragments of walls allowed him to argue tentatively for public and domestic buildings of considerable size and richness. While the illustrations of Roman London were dry and uncompromising, interest in his discoveries and his insights was far more pervasive. We've only to look at popular publications such as those by Charles Knight on London or John Wickham Archer's Vestiges of Old London to see how his findings, very often unattributed, were being incorporated into standard accounts of London's early history. And there certainly was a fascination in the idea of a buried city that takes us back to Pompeii, and also Victorian interests in geology and in covering the truth about history through excavation. In Archer's Vestiges of Old London, we find the conception of a complete hidden city buried underground. London, he wrote, is still surrounded by the foundations, at least, of her mural girdle, within which lie buried the traces of temples, dwellings, baths, pavements, monuments, utensils, and other vestiges, samples of which are found almost as often as the soil is open to the old level of the arts and economy of the Roman inhabitants of Londinium. And were it possible that the superstratum should be removed, as at Pompeii, we might find a complete ground plan of a Roman city exhibited in its existing remains. But what of Roman towns outside London? To what extent did this interest in Romano-British origins find a response in the provinces? Roman antiquities were not uncovered on quite the same scale as in London, but local histories, articles in antiquarian and archaeological journals, and even diaries, such as that of Roche, to whom I introduced you yesterday, are testimony of a constant discovery, as we see illustrated here, of Romano-British civilization. And many towns, of course, actually did retain far more visible elements of Roman origins, notably the Jury Wall in my own town of Leicester, or simply through the street plan, the rectilinear street plan, which helped to provide a framework around which the more imaginative antiquary could discuss his finds. Diva, Lindum, Glevum, or Eboracum were no longer simply names on a Roman itinerary or an inscription, but were populated settlements of streets, public buildings, and private houses, the physical form of which could still be traced through the spaces of a modern city. One of the striking ways in which this is demonstrated are the attempts by 19th century antiquaries to reconstruct a street plan of a Roman city and superimpose it upon the modern layout, the better to emphasize the relationship between the ancient and the modern. So we've got Stukely's plan of Roman London from Itinerarium Curiosum from the 1720s, and this is one from Exeter, 1740s, where you've actually got the modern names as well as the Roman names and the location of key landmarks such as the cathedral aligned with the original Roman city. What is interesting is the extent to which these finds filtered through into the representation of towns to a more popular audience, which brings me back to my original theme, the invention of a historic town. Did this actually affect representations? If we look at York, for example, a city renowned for its Roman antiquities, was a burst of activity in the late 17th and early 18th century, which informed Francis Drake's heavily Romanizing history, Eboracum. And Drake saw it purely as a Roman centre of power. But the Roman origins of the city continued to frame 19th century accounts, even as the picturesque qualities of the medieval fabric, which I'll talk about tomorrow, began to assume greater prominence. In the early 19th century, we find William Hargrove, local historian and publisher, beginning to include notices of recent finds. And he details tessellated pavements, burial urns, inscriptions, still very fragmentary, but his guidebooks are beginning to articulate a sense of York as a place of trade and commerce, frequented by merchant ships and pleasure boats, as well as the military galleys. The pavements were the floors of baths of opulent private individuals, not military generals, and he ventured to identify particular sites, such as the Temple of Serapis. York's Roman street plan had been lost underneath successive layers of urban habitation, but in 1818 he tried to draw a parallel between the plan of York and that of ancient Rome, further proof, he suggested, of its identity as Altera Roma. But 12 years later, when there were excavations of gas mains and sewers and the York and North Midland Railway barging its way through, the antiquary Charles Well-Beloved managed to actually draw up an approximate outline and orientation of the original street plan, which again feeds into the guidebooks. Chester was renowned as having been a centre of Roman military power and home of the 20th Legion. And the city's military identity was very much reinforced in the 18th century thanks to the Richard of Cirencester forgery, which gave some highly plausible detail about its importance as a Roman garrison. And he argued that it being entirely built by the legionaries of the 20th Legion. Well, Charles Bertram, who was the forger, did. The city's subsequent importance as a strategic military stronghold throughout the Middle Ages served to reinforce this as a very militarised image. And it's meant that in guidebooks there's always a strong emphasis on the Roman origins of Chester. But it's becoming more civilian, more domestic in the 19th century. So in Hemingway's Panorama of Chester in 1836, he starts to imagine how the Romans would have lived in the city. And he picks up William Stukeley's suggestion that the famous Chester rows were originally Roman porticos. And so he finds a continuity in function as well as form. So he implied that these would also have been the shopping area of the Romans. Thomas Hughes, a couple of decades later, is conjuring up a vision of Roman Chester where the soldiers and the inhabitants are plying the pickaxe, the trowel, and the spade, piling stone upon stone in the erection of a forum, the baths, and the suidatories of domestic life. And these were a crucial part of the itinerary, the tourist itinerary in Chester, but it's a vision of Roman soldiers and civilians living side by side, creating a Roman town. In Lincoln, the Roman colonia of Lindum, it couldn't claim quite the same military importance, but the outline of fortifications are still very visible in the street plan, indeed been noticed by Camden, and there's also the visible proof of the Newport, Stukeley's little engraving there from Itinerarium Curiosum, and this is actually a bit more colourful picture, so I'll leave you with that one. So the Roman Gate of Newport, which is always noted. And so this is, again, a standard part of any kind of Lincoln in the 18th century, identifying its Roman status. But in the 19th century, early 19th century readers are being reminded of the time's commercial functions as well. So Guide in 1835 points out how the outline of the Roman city, being much smaller than the present one, would have been very closely built up and thickly inhabited. It was a city of great importance, not just militarily, but also for trade, in pursuit of which the Romans had gradually extended the suburbs down the hill towards the river, as was being revealed in excavations. The primitive races, the author suggested, intermixed, and the peaceful arts were cultivated. Lindum, as it was then called, being so exceeding well situated for communication with the German Ocean and with the northern colonies, became a great trading emporium, and the town was extended to the bed of a tidal river. The finds of pavements and remains of baths were proofs of its former magnificence and the social advances and domestic refinement that followed upon the pursuit of prosperous trade. So Lincoln, like Chester, was a town whose trade had seen better days, and we can see this in terms of part of an ongoing effort to revive a flagging economy and to draw the connections between commerce and civilization. The assertion of its commercial importance was therefore partly an exercise in rewriting the past to validate the ambitions of the present and to identify a similar commercial role for Lincoln in a modern British Empire whose sway was even wider than that of Rome. But it also reflects the fact that Roman Britain was being identified as a place of trade. This brings me to the final point I want to touch on in this lecture, that is the question of what antiquarianism or archaeology contributed to the articulation of a 19th century narrative of civilization and modernity. For H. Smith, the history of London and the history of civilization were inextricable. London, he wrote, is connected with the history of the introduction of civilization to Britain, and its importance and influence as a city of commerce was marked out even before the arrival of the Romans. The archaeological record was the most powerful testimony to this historical evolution and proof of the unbroken continuity of commerce, trade, and civilization, the basis of the modern city. Upon the site of London, which even in Roman times was the largest city in Britain by a considerable degree. Reviewers picked up on this and his evidence for the sophistication and extent of urban settlement in Roman Britain, and also for the longer-term continuity. Alongside the more generally recognised benefits of Roman rule, such as roads or the introduction of arts and manufactures, was this idea that there was a municipal rule which had survived the wreck of Roman power and was, as one reviewer put it, productive of immense benefit. This book, continued the reviewer, shows the reader who's not normally interested in antiquities for the first time that the national civilization amongst us which we live in is but the aggregate of older nations, and the Roman with his bronzes and his pottery was so much an indirect cause of what is great amongst us as the Saxon with his love of liberty and his mastery in goldwork, or the Norman with his divine eye for architecture. Smith was reluctant to come out with such sweeping generalisations himself. As another reviewer noted, Mr. Roche Smith is not an author with views and theories or generalisations of history, but a collector and a cataloguer. But the evidence of this Romano-British urban civilization could be incorporated into much wider contemporary debates about the nature of urbanism and the debt that the modern English state owed not just to the Saxon, but to the Roman and British antecedents. It's very easy to let Charles Kingsley and Edward Freeman carry one away on a tide of Anglo-Saxonism. But the work of Roche Smith, and even his more explicitly Saxonist colleague Rhind, contributed to an important argument that it was the Romans who introduced urbanism and the values of civic life, and it was the legacy of Roman urbanism in places such as Londinium that taught the invading Saxons how to live in urban society. Prior to that, they were, of course, as generations of antiquaries and historians had argued, following Tacitus, forest-dwelling freedom lovers to whom urban life was antithetical. Thus, Roche Smith's emphasis upon the continuity of London, which the absence of obvious ruins and antiquities demonstrated, was an important plank in this argument. We'll pick up on the influence of Roman urban settlements upon the Saxons in the next lecture. Thank you.